We're here with Chris Folk at Folk Law in Liverpool today. He was called to the bar in 2005, and he practices real estate law and wills and estates here in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. We're going to go over property migration and what that means, and answer a few common questions that we run into during transactions.
So do you want to give us a quick summary of what a migration even is?
Sure. So migration is the process of converting a property from the old names-based, paper-based system into the land registration system, which the Nova Scotia government brought in around 2003 to 2005. They phased it in beginning in Colchester County and down here on the South Shore. We were a couple of the last counties to be brought into it. But essentially, under the old system, every time a property changed hands or was mortgaged, there had to be a title search done of the property, going back at least 40 years to find a good chain of title, and going forward from there. So it became a bit redundant after a while. So if a property was sold in 1985, then sold again in 1990, sold in 1992, every time there had to be a title search done of that property. So the land registration system, the idea of that is that a lawyer does a title search of the property, then the lawyer submits the legal description for the property, and then they file what's called the application for registration, which identifies the owners of the property, any right-of-ways or easements that affect the property, any mortgages or judgments or liens that are on the property, and then the lawyer certifies to the government and to the land registration system that title to that property is good. And then once the property has been migrated into the land registration system, it's a one-time process. Once it's in the system for good. And then from that point forward, anytime it changes hands, there's no longer that need to go back and do that 40-year title search.
Awesome. That was very descriptive. That's good. So can you give us a little overview? If somebody were to approach you and say, I want to sell my piece of land, what are you going to look for as a lawyer to actually complete that migration? What would be involved?
So the first thing I do is just look on property online, and I try to find the deed that gave the property to the current owner. I usually work backwards from there and go back and try to find that root of title. And the other thing that I look for is check property online mapping and compare that with the legal description to see whether it is approximately a match. It doesn't have to be necessarily a perfect match, but to make sure that it's, for example, the property isn't shown as a square on property online, but the legal description describes it as a triangle, for example. Because if that's the case, then we might need to, find some additional information, see if there's any surveys that were done of the property, and if not, maybe the person might need to engage a surveyor to see what the configuration of the property really is. And
So a surveyor doesn't necessarily need to be involved, only if there's a discrepancy or something that you find?
Yeah, that's right. A property, sometimes I'm asked whether it's necessary or whether it's a mandatory requirement to have property surveyed before migration or as part of the migration process. It's not required. It's usually not necessary. The only time that it's really necessary is sometimes, like I say, if there's a discrepancy between what's shown on property online and what's described in the deed, or sometimes if you have a legal description that contains errors, which does sometimes happen, or if you have a description that's just so vague that it's not really possible to determine what the exact size or boundaries of the property is. So sometimes I'll see really old deeds that'll say, it's bounded on the west by the old birch tree, bounded on the north by the big rock, and bounded on the east by, Farmer Joe's field.
A couple chains in between.
And then, but it doesn't, and it might not even give any chains or feet or acreage even. So for the person to say, well, property online shows it as being, a certain size or shows the boundaries a certain way, and the owner's like, I think that's wrong. They may need to get a surveyor to figure out, okay, exactly how big the parcel is and how it's configured.
Another thing we run into that's sometimes holds up migrations is access, especially in rural Nova Scotia.
Yes.
A lot of like landlocked woods properties and things like that. So can you speak to proving access, or maybe any instances where it's like an old woods road going to a property, like how you would go about proving that? You have to search other deeds, or how does that process work?
Yeah, so sometimes there will be cases where you get a property that's not on a public road, and there's nothing in the deed to say that it's together with a right-of-way or an easement to get basically from point A to point B, from the public road to the property. So in that case, I will check adjacent properties. So sometimes on property online, they'll show old woods roads as being red lines on property online. And so if I see, okay, well, the public road is here, the property's over here, there's a red line crossing the property that's in between. Okay, so maybe there is on the ground an old woods road. I'll check the deeds in the property that it looks like the road is crossing to see if maybe that property says something in their deed about being subject to a right-of-way. In that case, I can use that as what's called essentially the enabling instrument that gives access for the other parcel. If not, then basically in order to get access, sometimes you can have statutory declarations signed by people in the area who have personal knowledge and for a period of 20 years or more that can sign a statutory declaration confirming that access has been basically open, notorious, continuous, and without permission for over 20 years. And in that case, sometimes you can use statutory declarations to say that, yeah, this property does have access. And other times, sometimes with old woods parcels, a property doesn't have to have access in order to be migrated or in order to be sold. It's something that can affect the marketability of a property. Obviously, if a person doesn't have legal access, maybe it might scare off a potential buyer. But other times, if the person, maybe they own an adjacent parcel anyway, so they say, it's not a big deal that this one doesn't have access. I'd like to buy it anyway. So it's.
So what happens if you go through this whole process and it's found out that the owner doesn't have adequate title to the property? Like, is it possible that they lose the property, or?
So they wouldn't lose the property. Depending on what the issue is, sometimes it can be addressed through again statutory declarations. It's a lot trickier and more expensive to migrate that way because there's a number of other hoops that the migrating lawyer has to jump through, but it is possible to do it that way in some cases. In other cases, it's not possible, and the owner might need to obtain a lawyer to do what's called a quieting of titles application, where essentially it's a court application that an owner brings forward, and it goes through a process, and if the owner is successful, then at the end they get a certificate of title from the government saying, yes, you have good title to this property. But again, that's a whole other kettle of fish, and and looking at quite an expensive and time consuming process there. And but it's not a situation where if somebody asks me to migrate a property and I say, you don't have good title for whatever reason, they don't lose the property per se. Sometimes there'll be cases where there is title, but it doesn't go back quite far enough to the 40-year mark. So there have been a couple of cases where I've said to people, when we get to 1984, there's a good root of title there, so you'll be able to migrate your property, if you want to wait until the root deed is March 3rd, 1984. If you can wait until March 3rd, 2024, then we can do it at that time.
What's your general recommendation if somebody wants to, if they're thinking about selling the property, whether it's a house or land, and maybe it's different for the two, but would you say it's best to have it migrated completely before you even think about listing it, or at least have you take a look at it before you list it, or just deal with it after there's an agreement in place?
It's a good idea to look at it as soon as possible, because sometimes there might be a case where I can look at it and maybe identify an issue early on and be able to solve it. The problem with waiting until an agreement's already signed and in place is if you have a buyer who's looking for, say, a quick closing date, like 2 to 3 weeks, and it's not migrated, then it can be hard to get it migrated in time for closing. And if there's any issue that comes up, then essentially the seller is looking at having to go back to the buyer and say, hey, sorry, I can't get the property migrated by the closing date. And at that point, if the buyer chooses to opt out of the agreement, then the buyer has the legal right to do so. So it is a good idea to have it at least looked at if you're thinking about listing property for sale. And at that, I can usually look at it and tell pretty quickly if there's going to be any problems. And so then at least that way, if there are some issues, then we can maybe look at getting those ironed out before an agreement's signed and before we have that closing date deadline.
Yeah. If you want to give or will a property to a family member, does that need to be migrated to do so?
No. So the trigger for migration is basically what's called a transfer for value. So if you're either selling it for money or if you're mortgaging it, the property has to be migrated before either of those things can happen. But if you're just gifting it to someone, then that's not a trigger for migration. Or if you're leaving it to someone in your will, that's also not a trigger for migration. Sometimes people, if they're gifting it to a family member, especially if it's maybe an older parent gifting it to a child as part of their estate planning, they might say, look, I don't want them to have to worry about migration down the road. Let's get it migrated now. In which case, no problem, we can do that. But it's not a requirement.
Okay. Is migration the final word on all these different things, like boundaries and size and things, or is there something that supersedes it?
Yeah, so the Land Registration Act specifically states, and that's the act that governs the land registration system and the migration process, it specifically states that the exact size, location, and boundaries of a parcel are not guaranteed by the migrating lawyer or by the land registration system. So the only way to have those things identified with 100% certainty is to engage a surveyor. A surveyor can certify the exact size of a parcel, the exact location, the exact boundaries. So if, for example, somebody buys a parcel and they think, well, it's about 5 acres, then later on they find maybe it's only 4 acres. Well, there's nothing in the Land Registration Act that would say that they can go to the migrating lawyer, they can go to the government and say, hey, the property's smaller than I thought, I want to make a claim. There's nothing in the Land Registration Act that allows for that to happen.
The one we always get asked is how much does it cost and how long does it take?
Yeah.
Any generals there?
Yeah. So the baseline for migration usually is around, for me anyway, is $1,200 plus HST, and then the government also charges a $100 fee similar to a recording fee each time a migration is finalized. So that's sort of the baseline that we're looking at. Some lawyers charge title search fees separately. So they might say, well, my legal fees for migration are, $800, for example. But then when you get the bill, you see, okay, legal fees for migration, $800, title search fee, $350 or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Because some lawyers like myself, I do most of my own title searches. Some lawyers have title searchers that they retain to do the title search work for them, and then they bill that separately as a disbursement. It can be more, of course, if there's issues that need to be addressed, like for example, statutory declarations for to confirm access or something like that. Also, if a property is split by a road, this is a common one. If it's split by a road or by a natural water course, it has to be migrated in separate pieces. So in that case, instead of doing one migration, then I have to do 2 migrations or more. But in those cases, I usually I normally give a break on the legal fees there. So depending on the exact circumstances. But yeah, that's
about a month you should give yourself or so to get all.
Yeah, in terms of time frame, it really It depends sort of partly on how busy the registry staff is. When it's slow, because they're as part of the migration process, I have to do certain things and submit them to registry staff, and then they have a certain amount of time to approve them or reject them. And so sometimes if the registry's not too busy, I can submit the legal description for the property, and maybe it gets approved in a day. If they're really busy, they have up to 3 business days for that step. So I might submit it on a Friday, may not get it back till next Wednesday. And of course there's time for the title search as well. Generally speaking, I say around 2 to 3 weeks, sort of budget that amount of time in. I can normally get them done more quickly than that. But that's sort of the general time frame that I say, you know what, if you're looking for a ballpark, you know, that's give or take what it's going to be. You know, if I have a client who calls and says, you know, I really need this migrated, you know, as soon as possible, then I can usually get it done more quickly.
Yeah. Cool. I think
that's all we had.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, it was actually really informative for us too, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys very much.
Yeah. Thanks again. If you need your property migrated, you know who to call. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.